In 2013, Greg Kelly was a rising football star in Cedar Park, Texas, an honor student with a clean record, a full scholarship on the horizon, and a community that cheered him on every Friday night. But in a sudden and devastating twist, that promising future was ripped away when the then 18-year-old was arrested and accused of indecently assaulting a 4-year-old boy at an in-home daycare run by the mother of his best friend, Jonathan McCarty. Greg was staying at the McCarty home because his own parents were battling serious medical conditions and couldn't care for him at the time. It was supposed to be temporary, a way for him to stay close to school and football. Jonathan, his best friend and fellow football player, lived in the same house. The two boys looked eerily similar. Same build, same hair, both athletes, and both 18. But when the accusation came, only one of them was investigated. Only one of them was prosecuted. Only one of them paid the price. Greg Kelly. The child who made the accusation was one of the daycare kids. In a Child Protective Services interview, he said a man named Greg, who played football, touched him inappropriately. He described pajamas the man wore, and the room where the abuse occurred. That room, it would later be discovered, was Jonathan McCarty's room, not Greg's, and those pajamas also belonged to Jonathan. But Sergeant Christopher Daly of the Cedar Park Police Department didn't seem to care about details. Despite multiple football players coming and going from the house, despite the fact that Greg was no longer even living in the home at the time of the alleged abuse, Daly zeroed in on one suspect, Greg Kelly, and never looked back. He never interviewed Jonathan. He never visited the crime scene. He never took photos of the house or asked any of the other daycare children if they'd seen anything. He didn't even try to verify whether Greg had access to the room the child described. Instead, Daly relied entirely on the Child Protective Services interview with the 4-year-old boy, an interview filled with inconsistencies and leading questions. No photo lineup was shown. No attempt was made to clarify the identity of Greg. The child simply said the man's name was Greg, and that was good enough for Daly. When a second child came forward, this time after Daly cold-called the boy's family and suggested abuse might have occurred, there were even more red flags. The boy said Greg didn't do anything to him. The daycare owner herself testified that she did not believe Greg could have committed the abuse. Even still, the investigation did not expand to look at anyone else, including Jonathan, who had a history of trouble with the law and would later be charged with assaulting a woman in 2016. Greg's attorney at the time, Patricia Cummings, made a fateful decision that sealed her client's fate. Rather than argue that someone else, perhaps Jonathan, was responsible, she insisted the abuse never happened at all. She refused to introduce the possibility of an alternate suspect, fearing it would suggest the crime had taken place. But her defense strategy ignored critical pieces of evidence and alienated potential support. It was later revealed that Cummings had a long-standing friendship with the McCarty family, a fact that cast an uneasy shadow over her motives. In July 2014, Greg Kelly was convicted of 2 counts of super-aggravated sexual assault of a child. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole. The jury deliberated for just 12 hours. The only evidence presented against him was the testimony of a 4-year-old child who said someone named Greg molested him. There was no DNA evidence, no forensic evidence, no physical signs of abuse, no eyewitnesses, just a name and a system that failed. While Greg sat behind bars, his girlfriend, Gabrielle Anderson, never gave up. They had been sweethearts since grade school. Gabrie's father, Greg's high school football coach, also stood firm in his belief that Greg was innocent. When interviewed, he wept on camera, openly pleading for justice. Their loyalty helped bring in outside advocates, including Jake Bryden, a former student of Coach Anderson's who didn't even know Greg personally but felt something about the case was off. Jake reached out to Greg's mother, Rosa Kelly, a woman who had already sacrificed everything, her home, her health, and her peace of mind, to keep her son's case alive. Rosa had sold her house to pay for legal defense. She visited Greg every weekend, raised her other children, and continued to believe in her son's innocence even when hope was scarce. Bryden organized public rallies, called media outlets, and hired a private investigator, to re-examine the case. Meanwhile, newly elected Williamson County District Attorney Sean Dick began to question how the case had been handled. He was shocked at what he found. The original investigation had been deeply flawed, and it became clear that a miscarriage of justice had occurred. In 2017, a Texas Ranger named Cody Mitchell reviewed the case and immediately noticed glaring problems. He confirmed that the police had failed to investigate alternative suspects. The child's description clearly pointed to Jonathan McCarty's bedroom. The pajamas the child described were Jonathan's own. McCarty himself, by then, was in prison for violating his probation in a drug case. In 2019, after mounting public pressure and an independent reinvestigation, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Greg Kelly's conviction. The court ruled that Greg's constitutional rights had been violated and that he had received ineffective assistance of counsel. Finally, after 4 long years in prison, Greg Kelly was a free man. Later that year, the charges against him were formally dropped. Greg was officially exonerated and declared innocent. He had survived years of false imprisonment, flawed police work, and legal betrayal, and somehow emerged with his dignity intact. In 2020, Showtime released a documentary series titled Outcry, chronicling Greg's ordeal and exposing the systemic failures that led to his conviction. It sparked national conversations about wrongful convictions and the need for reform in child sex abuse investigations. After his release, Greg didn't seek revenge. He sought to rebuild. He enrolled at the University of Texas, studying business before switching to kinesiology, in hopes of remaining close to sports. He joined Eastern Michigan University's football program, not as a player, but as a mentor and advocate. He became a voice for justice reform and co-founded Tomahawk Targets, an axe-throwing company born out of a skill he picked up in prison. In 2019, Greg and Gabe remarried, with Jake Bryden, the man who helped free him, officiating the wedding. Greg later won a substantial, undisclosed legal settlement from the city of Cedar Park, which he used to repay his mother for her sacrifices. In 2023, he bought her a 1.3-acre property as a token of gratitude. "Since my release from prison," Greg said, "I had set many goals. One of them was to repay my mother's sacrifice. I always wanted to keep her close." As for Jonathan McCarty, he was never formally charged in the Kelly case. Yet, according to sources close to him, he allegedly admitted to friends that he was responsible for the abuse Greg was wrongly convicted for. It's a haunting footnote in a case filled with errors, omissions, and willful neglect. Sergeant Christopher Daly, who led the investigation, resigned in the year 2020. He continues to defend his work to this day. Greg Kelly spent 4 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, convicted by a system that never gave him a real chance. But what he lost in years, he gained in resilience. His story is now a symbol, not just of failure, but of how truth, determination, and community can overcome even the most crushing injustice. The sea was calm that morning in July 1997, but it bore witness to something deeply unsettling. 25-year-old Megan Louise Rose was found dead at the base of the cliffs at Point Cartwright on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic suicide. Alcohol in her system, a cliff edge, and no clear signs of foul play made it easy, almost too easy, for authorities to close the case quickly. But beneath the surface of that simple story lay questions that would haunt those closest to her, unanswered for nearly 3 decades. Megan was a kind soul. Aged care and disability nursing was her calling, and those who worked with her described a woman with endless patience and compassion. She had a soft way of speaking, a gentle demeanor that made even her most vulnerable patients feel safe. But like so many women in quiet, unassuming lives, Megan carried secrets, wounds she didn't always speak of. And one of those secrets was her former partner, Keith Lee's. Their relationship had ended before her death, but it hadn't been clean. It hadn't been peaceful. It had been marred by control, manipulation, and increasing distance. Still, when she died, there was no major investigation into his involvement. Megan was gone, and with her, the truth. Back then, there wasn't much appetite for probing too deeply into the circumstances of a young woman's death when it could be categorized so neatly. The cliffside told a convenient story, and so the file was closed. The narrative: Megan Rose had taken her own life. But some people never stopped asking questions. In 2022, the Queensland Police Cold Case Investigation Team reopened Megan's file. New forensic technologies, shifts in investigative culture, and growing pressure to revisit historic injustices provided the momentum they needed. What they found was chilling. Megan had taken out a $200,000 life insurance policy just months before her death. The beneficiary? Keith Lees. He had collected the payout after her death, seamlessly, with barely a whisper of suspicion. But detectives discovered something else. Lees had a dark past, one that extended far beyond Megan. In 2004, Keith Lees had been convicted of a separate murder, a second life claimed, a second act of violence linked to the same man who once stood by Megan's side. That conviction forced investigators to take a second look at his relationship with Megan, and the narrative of suicide began to crumble. Evidence that had once been overlooked was re-examined under a new light. Statements that had seemed benign now screamed of control, coercion, and possible premeditation. The dots that were never connected in 1997 started forming a picture that no one could ignore any longer. In July 2023, nearly 26 years after Megan's death, an arrest warrant was issued for Keith Lees. By the time authorities caught up to Lees, he had already slipped through the cracks. For 18 months, he evaded capture, not by hiding underground, not by fleeing the country, but by blending in. Living under an alias, he found shelter among religious communities, church groups that welcomed him without suspicion, unaware of the storm he brought with him. He was a ghost in plain sight, someone whose past had been buried just deeply enough that a new name could erase it, but it couldn't erase Megan. In January 2025, a tip-off brought everything to a halt. Lees was arrested in Durrell, a quiet suburb northwest of Sydney. Lees was arrested on Kenhurst Road, ending a manhunt that had stretched across states and years. The following day, in a Sydney court, he was denied bail and held in custody. When he appeared, dressed in a black shirt and sporting a long white beard, he looked almost nothing like the man shown in earlier police appeals. In addition to the murder warrant, he was charged with assaulting a police officer, dealing with identity information to commit an indictable offense, and possessing that same information. While in custody, he reportedly tried to bite an officer. He was extradited to Queensland 1 week later and charged with Megan's murder. At Brisbane Domestic Airport, he was escorted by officers, surrounded and silent. It marked the beginning of the legal process that many feared might never come. Police confirmed they would be seeking to withdraw the assault and identity-related charges to focus on the murder case. His extradition made headlines across the country. Detective Senior Sergeant Tara Kentwell spoke plainly about what the Queensland Police hoped for. She said it was never too late for witnesses to come forward. Relationships and loyalties change. People who were once scared may no longer be, and we would encourage those people to come forward. The arrest shook the Sunshine Coast community, and Megan's family most of all. For them, it wasn't just justice long overdue. It was confirmation that they hadn't imagined it. That Megan's life had been taken, not lost. That the questions they had dared to ask had not been in vain. Keith Lees appeared in Brisbane court shortly after his arrest. He didn't apply for bail. There was little to say. The case was adjourned until the 28th of April, 2025, at Maracaidoor Magistrates Court. As of now, a $500,000 reward remains active for anyone with additional information that could lead to a conviction. Her older sister, Christine Richards, made a public plea before the arrest, urging Lees to turn himself in. "Help us to bring justice for Megan after all this time. Please, help us let her rest in peace." But while the legal machinery turns slowly, for Megan's loved ones, something else has shifted: vindication. After 27 years of doubt, confusion, and silence, the narrative around Megan Rose has changed. No longer dismissed as another sad story of mental health or quiet despair. Her story is now one of injustice, of stolen life, of an investigation that waited too long, but finally arrived. Megan Rose was not just a name in a report or a photograph in a news article. She was a daughter, a caregiver, a woman who loved quietly and gave freely. Her life mattered. Her death mattered. And finally, her story is being told the way it always should have been. On a cold, dark February night in 1987, the quiet halls of Everett Community College were shattered by the roar of flames engulfing its library. The fire blazed fiercely, consuming books, memories, and a part of the community's heart. Among the brave men who rushed into the inferno was Gary Parks, a 48-year-old firefighter known for his steady courage and warm spirit. Gary had been a pillar of the Everett Fire Department for years, a man who earned the affectionate nickname Parksy from colleagues who admired his dedication and kindness. That night, alongside 5 other firefighters, Gary faced the deadly blaze head-on, entering the building to battle the flames and save whatever could be saved. But the fire had grown too strong, fueled by something more sinister than an accident. Thick smoke filled the air, choking and blinding those inside. Flames roared in every corner, trapping the team in a nightmare of heat and suffocating darkness. Despite their training and bravery, the inferno proved too overwhelming. Gary Parks succumbed to smoke inhalation, dying in the line of duty. His death was the first Everett firefighter fatality on the job in nearly 20 years, and the shock rippled through the entire community. For those who knew Gary, the loss was unbearable. He wasn't just a firefighter. He was a husband, a father, a friend, a man who carried the weight of his community on his shoulders with humility and grace. The Everett Fire Department mourned deeply, and the city demanded answers. How could such a tragedy happen? Was this fire an accident or something worse? The investigation began immediately, but the fire had destroyed so much of the evidence that uncovering the truth proved difficult. Early suspicion fell on arson. Fires in public spaces like schools are sometimes deliberately set, and the severity of this blaze suggested intentional harm. The investigators combed through the wreckage, searching for any clue that could lead to the perpetrator. One name quietly circulated: Paul Keller, later known as the Angel of Death. Keller was a notorious serial arsonist who had set fires across the region, causing devastation and loss of life. Yet, despite the suspicion and his dark reputation, there was no solid evidence to link Keller to this particular blaze. The case stalled, leaving behind a cold trail of unanswered questions. As the years slipped by, the memory of the fire and Gary's death remained a painful shadow over Everett, but the investigation lost momentum. Then, decades later, new eyes reviewed the cold case files. Detective Wally Fenn was a man known for his tenacity and careful attention to detail. When he began to study the old investigation, he found something that had been missed. The fire seemed to have started near the rooftop book drop, a small window where library patrons could return books after hours. This detail suggested the fire was deliberately set by someone who had access to the roof late at night, possibly teenagers looking for mischief without understanding the deadly consequences that would follow. Detective Fenn shared his findings with the department, but before the case could gain new traction, he retired. The investigation passed to detectives Jim Massengale and Mike Atwood, who carried Fenn's insights forward. Their persistence was unrelenting. They re-examined witnesses, interviewed suspects, and dug deeper into the past. Years of patience and hard work paid off in 2017 when Atwood finally secured a breakthrough: a confession. Atwood met with Elmer Nash in Snohomish County Jail. Nash, once a suspect but never charged, admitted to starting the fire along with 2 friends as a reckless prank that spiraled out of control. The confession shocked the community. Nash revealed intimate details about the fire's origin, things only someone involved would know, confirming the deliberate nature of the blaze and exonerating other suspects. When shown a photograph of Gary Parks, Nash's facade crumbled. He broke down, expressing profound remorse for the pain and loss caused. "We were just dumb kids," he said, tears flowing as he begged forgiveness from Gary's family and the city. Though Nash later partially withdrew parts of his confession, the core truth remained intact, supported by witness statements and forensic evidence. The confession reopened old wounds but also provided a path toward healing. In 2021, Elmer Nash pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as the community sought justice for Gary. His family, friends, and fellow firefighters found a measure of peace knowing the truth had finally come to light. The Everett Community College Library, once reduced to ashes, was rebuilt, symbolizing resilience and the community's refusal to be defined by tragedy. Gary Parks' story became a solemn reminder of how a single moment of reckless behavior can irreparably alter countless lives. It underscored the bravery of firefighters who risk everything, the importance of thorough investigations, and the power of persistence in seeking justice. Though Gary was gone, his memory lived on, honored by those who carry forward his legacy of courage and sacrifice.